India's economic relationship with China is once again making headlines. Despite years of geopolitical tensions with Beijing, it seems that India might be establishing something of a worrying import dependency on China. Recent trade data shows that India's imports from China are up, but exports are down. This is also coming at a time when China has made, again, global headlines by posting figures that show that it has an almost $1 trillion global trade surplus. Joining me now to unpack the India-China economic relationship, whether this is something that is a worrying development for India, is Professor Rajat Kathuria of Shiv Nadar University. He's, of course, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences there. Professor Kathuria, thank you so much for joining me here on India Today Global. Could I ask you to begin by unpacking these developments? China posting these numbers of a $1 trillion global trade surplus, a rising trade deficit between India and China. How should we be looking at these developments?
Well, I think, these latest figures that have come out of China are in anticipation of probably these increased tariffs that President Trump has been threatening. So there's some sort of front loading happening on their exports, although sort of that is just proximately the reason for their really large, I think, unprecedented globally, a $1 trillion trade surplus. So in fact, I mean, it also underlies the fact that China has really become the factory of the world. We used to say that, all manufacturing happens in China, and it used to be labeled as the factory of the world. I mean, a $1 trillion trade surplus in the current environment truly signals that the import dependence that countries have on China is now come to the fore. It's really become sort of crucial for the world to look at this very, very seriously. There are things that can be done, but I don't think there are things that can be done immediately to diversify away from China. One will never be able to decouple from China. I think that's a given, but there can be some diversification strategy. But it'll have to be coordinated, given that I think more than 100 countries today have China as their largest trading partner. So globally, this is, in some sense, a worrying development. For India, increasingly so, it's worrying because we run a sort of a deficit with China, which is in excess of $100 billion on the trade side. And there haven't been any, offsetting increases in exports to China. In fact, our exports to China have either leveled off or are declining. So our import dependence on China is growing. And given at a time when we want to increase exports of computers, of smartphones and electronics, most of these intermediate goods actually come in from China. So we haven't been able to create the domestic capacity to be able to substitute either away from China or manufacture at home. So for both these reasons, I think we need to look at a renewed trade strategy. And I guess the budget is coming up. I don't think the budget is going to be an important document where we can have a wholesale sort of evaluation of our trade strategy. But this is something that we must do.
Let me start by unpacking this picture a little bit with you. You've talked about India's rising trade deficit. Of course, India's importing a lot more than it exports to China. Could you unpack a little bit of these imports that India is bringing in? There is some concern coming out from experts that for in very, very key industrial sectors, whether we're talking about renewable energy, manufacturing equipment, so on and so forth, pharmaceuticals, India is really becoming worryingly dependent on Chinese imports. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, it is. As I said, it is a worrying factor that we have, nobody wants to put all their eggs in one basket. And given that China is so hugely and vastly competitive in terms of their pricing, it becomes difficult for India to remain competitive and diversify away from China. If we forcibly diversify away from China, then it's going to affect our own competitiveness. So I think it'll have to be a slow move away from China, including, I think, building domestic capacity. But I think the way we build domestic capacity is by increasing tariffs and hoping that that protectionist regime that we put in place will encourage domestic manufacturing. I think that is the wrong way to go. We shouldn't think of now tinkering with tariffs anymore. We should think of domestic reform at home, pretty much go down the route that we started about 15 years ago or 10 years ago, which is trying to improve the doing business indicators for India. And, going back to the question of, is it worrying for India to import so much from China? Indeed, it is. When you look at our trade with China and you deconstruct that trade, you will see that most of the trade that is coming in from China is not finished products. I think the popular press and the popular narrative in India is that, you think about Diwali that has just gone. I used to hear stories about people saying that even our Ganeshas and, idols of worship are imported from China. I mean, in a way to say that we are importing our finished goods from China. Nothing could be farther from the truth. We are actually, a huge import dependence on China is intermediate goods. And in fact, that is more worrying because it is the backward linkage with China, which means that we are importing from China to produce at home, which is thereby giving us some competitiveness in our electronics industry as well. We are exporting smartphones to the rest of the world, but a lot of those imports are coming in from China. And to be able to diversify away from intermediate goods, look at other countries to import from is also, vulnerable to importing Chinese equipment because China would probably be export. Let's say you think of Malaysia or think about Thailand or think about the ASEAN countries. If we import from there, it is equally likely that they are going to export to us goods or intermediates that they have imported from China. So I think our strategy for China has to be well thought out. And a part of that solution has to be trying to increase domestic manufacturing capacity without tinkering with tariffs. And I would say that this should be the strategy and we should put in place now. It's already too late, but we should put in place a strategy to do that now.
Right. Professor Kathuria, if I could ask you a question, some experts, of course, are also arguing that, look, yes, India is importing a lot from China, but of course, that's what developing countries do. They import a lot of important intermediate goods and so on and so forth when it comes especially to, let's say, the solar sector, building out India's electronics manufacturing capability. All of that will require inputs from China because India is, of course, trying to integrate itself more into global value chains, and China is already a dominant player in those value chains. Therefore, these imports are just a natural cost of doing business and therefore not really all that worrying. What do you think of that particular view?
So I think, China will remain an important trading partner for India. There's no doubt about that. In fact, China will remain an important trading partner for several countries in the world. So I think what I'm saying is that we should try and it's not that you're completely going to decouple from China, but you have to try and diversify from China, including manufacturing those products at home. It will be a slow process. The pace will be slow, but we have to try and do it now. Because if you're completely dependent on China, then you're vulnerable to shocks. COVID is just one example, but you're vulnerable to any shock which risks disrupting the supply chain and therefore make your own manufacturing either uncompetitive or it'll just drive you away from global markets. So, the goods that you mentioned, the products that you mentioned, pharmaceuticals, we import a lot of APIs from China. Solar panels are imported from China. Intermediate electronics components are imported from China. And, we've started trying to build semiconductor capacity in India, although it's of the mature kind. It's not the cutting edge semiconductor technology, fabrication technology that we've started to, but it's a start. China did it the same way. When China started started to produce at home, it didn't go to the cutting edge immediately. Today, it's become the global sort of leader in electric vehicles, but it didn't do this overnight. It took it 25 to 30 years to get there. So it's going to be, for India too, it's going to be a long haul, but it's better to begin now. And I'm glad we've started with the semiconductor industry, but we should try and do the same thing with other, components, with other, intermediate goods so that we can build capacity at home and at least have reduced the dependence. We cannot eliminate, as I said, the dependence on China, but we must reduce the dependence so that if there is a shock in China, the disruption, if not eliminated, can at least be minimized. And then you're not held to ransom by a single country's strategies, either economic strategies or even to a large extent now geopolitical strategies.
Right, Professor. We've also seen over the last couple of years. You mentioned talking about building up India's domestic manufacturing capabilities. Of course, in that context, we've seen the PLI scheme, production linked incentive scheme, that has been one of those flagship schemes that the government has put into place to push this domestic manufacturing. How successful do you think the PLI schemes have been in their endeavors?
So when you think of building manufacturing capacity at home, and the PLI scheme has been in operation for about a decade, so I think it's been margin. It's not been very successful, but it's not been a failure either compared to some of the other schemes that we had, which ran foul of our international commitments. Schemes like giving subsidies to exports, etc., which ran foul of our international commitments in the WTO, etc. So the PLI is not, is consistent with our international obligations, and it's been a success. But I think, we'll have to completely leverage schemes like PLI, which gives you subsidies based on your production, to completely leverage them. You have to make production a little easier at home, which means all the domestic barriers to producing have to be eliminated, and to facilitate more production at home, domestic reform is also necessary. So by itself, PLI is a good idea, but it has to be accompanied by domestic reform so that you can use PLI, as economists would say, to create those spillover impacts, or to be able to use it as a force multiplier. You'll need to have domestic reform at home. By itself, it won't be as successful as it would be if you have accompanying domestic reform at home as well.
Could I ask you a little bit?
By domestic reform at home, I mean you have all these constraints in product markets, in capital markets, and in labor markets. All the doing business indicators. People still, you talk to industry, you talk to foreign investors, they still cite, although there's been some easing of those constraints of doing business in India, but India is still a hard place to do business compared to a lot of other countries.
Right. So could I also ask you about what we've seen over the last couple of years when we saw the COVID-19 pandemic? There was some conversation about China plus one investments. Lots of countries and lots of companies, foreign companies in China, saying that China is basically uninvestable. That was the phrase that was being thrown around at the time about the Chinese economy. China's economy continues to remain sluggish. Political repression, of course, has also increased. A number of countries and companies have looked to put investment in other nations. India was expected to be a big beneficiary of this China plus one move, but it seems, in the view of some, that actually Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam have tended to be much, much bigger beneficiaries of this China plus investment push than India. Would you agree with that assessment as well?
Yes, I mean, there is truth in that assessment. It may not be completely true, but yes. And remember, this is not the first time that we've said that India could benefit from investments that are moving away from China. It happened during the previous US-China trade war. It happened during COVID. It happened during the financial crisis. India always comes up as sort of an example of a country that could absorb the investments that are finding other destinations away from China. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to completely capture that. Some of it has come to India, but we haven't been able to completely capture. And the reason why India has always held up as the next manufacturing hub of the world is because it has the population, it has the land mass, it has the market to be able to be the next factory of the world. But unfortunately, that sort of has never been realized completely. And as a result, some of the smaller countries that have opened their doors to business in a much more friendly manner, like Cambodia, Vietnam, some of the ASEAN countries, and even Bangladesh to an extent in textiles, have reaped the benefits of investments going away from China. But remember, as I've been saying, that this is happening at the margin. China continues to provide sort of exports of goods, both intermediate and finished goods, to the rest of the world. So this diversification away from China is happening right now. It is happening at the margin. To be able to make it much more pervasive will require a long, long time. And by then, China would have shifted away from manufacturing to become a service-dominated economy, as most countries in the world, when they become very high income countries, then they diversify away from manufacturing because manufacturing becomes expensive, and you go into more value-added, more services-based economies. So that will also happen maybe 50 years, 60 years later in China. But right now, what is happening is that some investments are moving away from China. However, China continues to be in some sense, the factory of the world. At the margin, some investments are moving out of China. And unfortunately, India hasn't been the beneficiary of those investments that are moving out in the sense that it could have. And this is not the first time that India is projected as the beneficiary. This is probably third or fourth time that India could have been a beneficiary of investments moving away from China. And I hope that we don't say this again. And now India gets its act together and engages in some domestic reform so that we can attract these investments that are moving out of China.
Right. Professor, could I also ask you for a slightly broad-ranging view of what you think needs to change now in the context of reforms, what new changes India can bring in? Of course, there has been some conversation saying that the latest GDP numbers are showing that, of course, growth has tapered. You're seeing questions about whether consumption is strong enough in the Indian economy at this point in time. And lots of people have taken this moment to argue that, look, we just had Dr. Manmohan Singh pass away very recently, and he was best known for engineering the 1991 reforms, and people saying that, look, India needs another set of major economic reforms if it wants to power the next generation of growth. So what would you say are those reform items, agenda items that the Indian government needs to look at right now? You've talked about tariffs, you've talked about land, labor, capital, but could you just expand on that, what that next generation of reforms could look like?
So I think some of them are policy reforms, but most of them, I would say, the kind of reforms that we've been talking about since the first generation of reforms that happened in India, which is dismantling the license Raj that you spoke about, the 1991 sort of reforms. And then it was not only 1991, a lot of the reforms happened post 1991, but essentially focused on the product markets where government exited most of the industries that it had occupied. And that continues to happen even as we speak. Air India is the latest example of an industry that the government has exited, but the government still operates, let's say, in the telecom sector through BSNL and MTNL. So those reforms that were begun in 1991, in some sense, are continuing. But we have to now take those reforms into sort of the labor market, the capital market, and also, do implementation of the reforms, good implementations of the reforms that we've started in 1991. And to some extent, as I'm saying, that some of those have continued, but I think implementation is key. Reports that come in from states, reports that come in from various places of doing business, is that it's not easy to start a business, it's not easy to pay taxes, it's not easy to get environmental clearances, it's not easy to acquire land, it's not easy to get labor certifications, etc. So all of this continues to be India's bugbear, right? And the latest semiconductor subsidy that we've given, to some extent, we've said that it should be plug and play. We'll give you the subsidies. Please come and set up this fabrication unit in India, and India has offered almost $2 billion worth of subsidy for about 20,000 jobs that are going to be created there. So this is not something. Clearly, the subsidy that you're giving to semiconductors is not creating the kind of jobs that India needs, but it's creating sort of an environment which focuses on technology, and hopefully some of the spillovers will happen and will be technological upgradation in some of the other sectors. But I think what I'm focusing, what I would like the government to focus on is labor-intensive manufacturing, where a lot of our sort of abundant factor, which is labor, relatively unskilled, it's becoming more skilled, relatively uneducated, it's becoming more educated. But unless you're able to absorb those large numbers of relatively less educated, relatively less skilled people in large-scale manufacturing industries, footwear, clothing, leather, textile, apparel. These are the traditional industries. Of course, a lot of people will disagree whether that is the development strategy that India should adopt because of servicification that is happening of the Indian economy, or servicification of manufacturing that is happening in the Indian economy. But I, for one, still maintain that for the abundant factor, the nature of the abundant factor that we have in India, I think it's the good old manufacturing sector. The servicification and the servicification of manufacturing is happening at a high end, and is unlikely to absorb the kind of labor that we have that is waiting to be employed. The gig economy, the service economy is playing a little bit of role, but I think we still need those traditional sectors. So, as I said, the implementation of the reforms that we started in 1991, good implementation, and eliminating the bottlenecks that make transactions costs so high in India, that also needs to be done. So, roads, ports, trade facilitation, both domestic facilitation, facilitation of imports and exports, all of those. And these are well documented in India, and it will be difficult for me to sort of identify each one and give you case studies or at least examples of each one. But that's what I mean when I say that we need good implementation to sort of complement the policy relaxations or the reforms that we have done and we continue to do since we started these in 1991.
Understood. Professor Rajat Kathuria of Shiv Radha University, thank you so much for your time and for explaining to us what we're seeing in the India-China economic relationship.